The Ensemble podcast is intended for professional financial advisors. This content is created in partnership with our sponsor, Generation Life Limited, ABN 68 092 843 902, AFSL 225 408, and is limited to publicly available information. Before acting on any general advice, you should consider whether appropriate and obtain financial advice from a qualified financial advisor. Ensemble does not hold an AFS license and does not provide any financial advice or services or endorse any general advice. If a PDS or IM exists, you should obtain a copy and review it thoroughly before making a decision.
You're listening to Strategies to Facilitate Intergenerational Wealth Transfers, a special 5-part mini-series from the Ensemble podcast. Over 5 episodes, we talk to authors, practitioners, product providers and a lawyer to reveal what works and what doesn't for advisors and their clients when it comes to retiring and leaving a legacy.
As the pioneer of Australia's first truly flexible investment bond, Generation Life has been at the forefront of providing innovative, tax-effective investment solutions since 2004. As an innovation-led business, Generation Life constantly strives to enhance investment solutions to optimise after-tax investment performance for investors. As a leading specialist provider of tax-optimised investment and estate planning solutions, as well as investment-linked lifetime annuities, Generation Life works closely with financial advisors to secure the financial futures of many Australians and their families.
Hello and welcome to this special XY Advisor podcast mini-series focused on retirement income and the related advice issues. I'm Vince Scully, veteran advisor and founder of Life Sherpa, Australia's most affordable financial advice service. 2022 marks 165 years since the Australian Mutual Provident Society offered the first pension savings plans and 30 years since the introduction of compulsory super. Now, total assets in superannuation total almost $3.5 trillion and benefit over 16 million Australians. 2022 also marks the introduction of the Retirement Income Covenant for super funds, but more of that later. The history of superannuation in Australia has been marked by almost constant change. Super was either an attractive tax shelter for the wealthy and self-employed, or offered to a small proportion of the workforce, mostly the public service or white-collar private sector workers. By 1974, just under a third of the workforce benefit from employer-provided superannuation, and males received it at twice the rate of their female colleagues. Back then, life was simple. There was no tax on contributions, no tax on fund earnings, and only 3% tax on the resulting lump sum benefit. 1983 saw the introduction of a 30% tax on retirement benefits and the birth of rollover funds, which allowed this tax to be deferred indefinitely, or at least until death. Although readily avoided, this tax proved hugely unpopular, and protests led to pre-1983 balances being grandfathered at the old rate. Older advisors will recognise this as the source of the old pre- and post-components, which created much complexity. By 1988, then Treasurer Paul Keating cut this exit tax in half to 15% and levied a further 15% tax on contributions and fund earnings. Just 5 years later, compulsory super was born with 3% superannuation guarantee payments applying from July 1993, which lifted super coverage to 80% of the workforce and total super assets to $169 billion. Contributions at the time were made to a fund chosen by the employer or nominated in an industrial relations instrument such as an award. Members weren't given the choice of fund until 2004. Reasonable benefit limits were introduced in 1994, giving everyone a lump sum limit of $400,000 and a pension limit of $800,000. These and the related transitional reasonable benefit limits granted to existing members created a range of strategies for advisors. Looking eerily similar to the current Section 293 surcharge, a short-lived surcharge starting at 15% and later dropping to 12.5% was introduced in 1996 and abolished in 2005. The Costello budget of 2006 changed everything and greatly simplified the system. This created a series of immediate opportunities for advisors and taxpayers alike. These measures abolished RBLs, removed the requirement to draw benefits at 65, and eliminated tax on retirement benefits. This in effect replaced limits on benefits with limits on contributions. 2017 saw the introduction of the transfer balance cap to limit the tax concessions on pensions. I'll recap all of this to demonstrate that as advisors, change is ever present. Some of it good, some of it bad, but all of it creating opportunities for us to add value to our clients and improve our businesses. Those who embrace it will thrive, those who don't will ultimately fail. And all of this brings us to today's topic, the Retirement Income Covenant. specifically what it is and why it matters to both consumers and their advisors. The measure forces super funds, or more specifically the registrable superannuation entity or RSE, to formulate a retirement income strategy and publish a summary on their website by the 1st of July 2022. To help us understand what this means in practice, I'm joined in the studio by Ruth Stringer, a leading superannuation lawyer. Ruth is a partner at MinterEllison and a non-executive director at ASX-listed platform provider HUB24. She's previously worked at ASIC in the superannuation group and was general counsel at MLC shortly after NAB acquired it from Lendlease. Welcome, Ruth.
Thank you, Vince. Nice to be here.
Now, there's a lot been talked about the retirement income covenant, which sounds very strange. And as of July this year, our super funds have had a whole bunch of new obligations added. Can you tell us a little about what the retirement income covenant is?
Thanks, Vince. The covenant is a very strange sort of a word, but essentially it's a promise which is in the legislation, and it follows the pattern of many obligations that are in this legislation that are expressed as a covenant. But if we leave that to one side, essentially what it requires is for the trustees to formulate and develop a strategy, which is to do with developing retirement income or producing retirement income for members. And it follows, similar covenants exist now for investments. So there's a covenant to have an investment strategy, covenant to have an insurance.
So what's about covenants? Are these promises to members?
Yeah, essentially. It's effectively as if this was a clause written into the fund's deed. And therefore it means that it's enforceable, I suppose, by members if there were no covenant. And it's also enforceable under the superannuation legislation as well, that the trustee has to comply with the covenants, and if it fails to do so, then there are penalties attaching.
And so this covenant to have a strategy to deal with retirement income, what do the super funds actually have to do on July 1 of this year?
Well, on July 1, they had to have formulated a strategy, and the strategy has to take account of a number of things. Predominantly, it's about maximising retirement income while also balancing that against the risks of longevity risk, inflation risk, and various other prescribed matters. And so the strategy is really putting pen to paper and justifying what it is that you believe ought to happen to produce a good, solid, reliable, stable retirement income. And not only that, you have to publish a summary of it on your website. So I think there's a real transparency angle here that's, very useful, because it's requiring trustees to, I guess, justify what they either do or don't have by way of retirement income products, and what thought they've given to their own membership base, what their needs might be, how to meet those needs, recognising, I guess, really for the first time that the retirement phase, the decumulation phase, is very different from the accumulation phase, and really turning their minds to how to serve their members in providing good retirement income products.
Because most of the publicity and media we see about super is about that accumulation stage. And, I guess compulsory super of 1993 is just coming up on its 30th anniversary. So if you were a wet-eared graduate in 1993, you were still some way off retirement. So why do you think now?
Well, it's a great question. And I think, I've been practicing super since before 1993, actually. And I think, there was probably, I guess, a sense in which this was all very new. I think the boomer generation and had probably felt that we have a system of an old age pension in Australia, and that, if you owned your own home and you were going to get the pension, she'll be right, essentially. But I guess having had the move into compulsory super, which is clearly designed to augment the age pension, which is really not a luxurious lifestyle from what I can gather, then there's been a lot of focus on getting the account balances up. And so in the early days, you can imagine the balances were not terribly strong. But as the balances have been growing, I think that's the impetus to look at what is actually happening. And it's a maturity thing, I think, of our system, because it's not until you have decent sized balances that you need to start thinking a little bit more strategically about how to use those to fund a retirement income that replaces your salary. And obviously longevity has increased in that time as well. So the life expectancy for retirees is just a much longer period, and you're therefore running out of money toward the end of life becomes a bigger concern.
So this is just a strategy. So there's no requirement for the super funds to go and develop new products at this point.
Correct.
Is there a plan B or part B of this that will require them to?
At this point, I mean, I think, if we look at the genesis of how this came about, at an earlier point in time, the government was looking to be a little bit more directional in mandating what was going to be called a comprehensive income product for retirement, or a SIPR, bit of a mouthful. Yeah. But the government's walked back from that more prescriptive approach and really is looking at a light touch. And I guess because we've got the precedent of the strategy for investment strategy, which is a really important trustee function, the idea is, I think, designed to allow bespoke solutions and not to place any requirements, but really to place the asset on the trustee, I suppose, to justify what they're doing, to look to the needs of their particular member base, because, theirs could potentially be quite different depending on account balances or demographics. And so therefore to really take this further. But I think, having said all of that, I think the reality is as funds develop an initial strategy, as they gather data, as they think about what those needs look like and what the longevity risk might be, that they will start to look at product. I think product will inevitably come into the equation, and product development, will be part of what they'll end up doing.
So is this sort of subtle code that we really want you to get on and develop products, in the sense that, the old requirement to consider that the investment strategy must consider insurance needs, for example, which was generally became a part and parcel of a super fund, that you almost couldn't have one without insurance?
I think it is. I think it is a form of nudge. If you call that a nudge. And I think, we talked a bit before about the history to this, and the last time I saw any statistics on this, something like 94% of the retired population were in an account-based pension. And, I think for most people, trying to manage an account-based pension and work out how much can I safely withdraw and how much should I withdraw, what's the time horizon, how should I invest it, that's a pretty vexing problem for people. And so I think, to the extent product can be developed to make life a bit easier for the retiree confronting that problem, I think it's probably overdue.
Certainly what's often referred to as longevity risk, or for old blokes like me, a longevity opportunity, because I'd like to live a long and purposeful life for many years in retirement. So longevity, the length of time your pension has to last, is probably a bigger risk than what the market's going to do tomorrow. And yet, with the demise of defined benefits, we actually haven't really seen anything more imaginative coming out of super funds than account-based pensions.
That's right.
Are you seeing trustees looking to develop those sort of products?
I think that it's been very interesting, because if I look at the last 10 years, I've obviously had a lot of client trustees come to talk about these products, and very often I think they've been interested in doing it but didn't have the confidence because the competitive landscape was not such that others were doing it. And so there's only been very, very modest development to date. But I do think that the covenant is kind of a line in the sand. And not that there's products all launched on the 1st of July, but I think the kind of cycle we're in now is a lot of funds have committed, in writing in their strategies to at least consider expanding their product range and developing products that more explicitly address longevity risk. And so it feels like there's now a momentum and a commitment. So I do believe there will be more product development in that area.
One of the things that after being asked to do this, I went and actually tried to find these on quite a few super fund websites. It's generally not an easy task, but so most of them talk about longevity, and most talk about inflation. And of course, for anyone who wasn't around in the 70s and 80s, inflation right now is a bit of a novelty and potentially a very scary thing. And many seem to talk about advice or what tools can be provided to help people work this out themselves. So I guess the question is, that doesn't appear to be required by the Act as I read it. So if you were to advise a trustee, a hypothetical trustee, obviously we don't want to talk about any real ones, what would you be advise them to do around dealing with any other risks, which is a bit like the sixth step in the safe harbour for best interest? Do everything else you might think might be appropriate. What are the sort of things that would spring to your mind in that space?
Well, I mean, you've mentioned the longevity risk and the inflation risk, which are kind of explicit call-outs, I suppose. I mean, I think this is probably more a question for a financial person in terms of, what risks there might be, in terms of the member experience. Potentially, I guess you'd think about things like health risks. And I guess one of the difficulties in this area is if you were thinking about the risk of, for example, having to go into an aged care facility, you start to get into realms which are classically outside of superannuation and yet very, very important to the members' financial well-being in retirement. And so I think it is a bit of an open question what that any other risks might mean. I think one thing I would just say is that because the covenant is so new and we're really in the information gathering phase, I know a number of funds are going to survey their members and ask the members what the members are concerned about. And we'll also, I think, be looking at gathering a whole lot of data about, for example, the age pension and the cost of living, and trying to bring all of that information together, I suppose, before maybe changing the product mix or the way that they engage with retired members. So I think there's work to be done in really, the trustees will need to go out and look to what those risks might be and how they might be addressed within the construct of the fund.
Yeah, I mean, all those issues about health, aged care, dealing with kids and ageing parents at the same time, the so-called sandwich generation, does make this a lot more complicated than it might have seemed in 1993, where we had, as you say, most people relied on the age pension. What do we call them? The four pillars, being the age pension, family home,
the obviously the superannuation
and non-super savings. And those other ones are becoming bigger and bigger, with inflation in our home prices. If you look at the family balance sheet or the household balance sheets, the family home ranks right up there. It's still ahead of our super. For our younger members, their super tends to be bigger than their home savings, but as we head towards retirement, the big family home in Pymble is still worth more than most people's superannuation balance. And some of this seems to be working in a different direction, or pulling in a different direction than the recent changes about the transfer balance caps and all those things. So there seems to be a whole bunch of different things happening here which don't all seem to be pulling in the same direction.
I think that's right. And I mean, it's well known, I think, that superannuation has been a bit of a political football and getting a kind of really consistent position, particularly when you have the sole purpose test and, different ways of interpreting that test and, financial wellbeing in retirement, I'm speaking to the expert here, it is not just what you have in your super, it's the whole picture, and, health plays into it. And so it's a little artificial taking the super as a standalone. And I mean, super also has the constraint currently that each individual has their account in super. It's not a mixed or a joint asset.
It's not a household asset.
No, it's not a household asset. So there's some constraints around super that mean it doesn't work seamlessly in the mix there. But I think the idea of focusing on, I think to me it's a little bit like really just focusing the mind of the trustee on the fact that, well, what are we doing this for? It's not to sort of produce a really big number at 65 and then say off you go. It's really the focus needs to be, how am I going to assist in really providing retirement income or assisting the member to achieve that retirement income. And I guess coming back to the point about product, it's one of the reasons it's not prescriptive. One of the outworkings is to your point about generations. I mean, there's nothing in this that makes it illegal for a member to want to use their super to leave a bequest. That can still be accommodated. That's one of the many needs or wants of the member population. But it's having options that address other needs like the longevity risk and like the peace of mind of, income that's, immune from inflation risk and all the different permutations of member wants and needs that.
Although interestingly, leaving a legacy is not one of the requirements.
It's not intended to be one of the ones that the trustee should prioritise. So the trustee doesn't place a priority on that. But if the members choose to have that as a feature, then if you don't have it, they may go elsewhere.
And of course, we have a system where the fund's income or the trustee's income is dependent on assets under management. And obviously, the more the retirees spend the money, the less funds they're left with.
Absolutely.
Classic conflict of interest. Now, you mentioned that, at the point of retirement, there's a need for education, for knowledge, for advice, for understanding the options. And many of the strategies, is that the word? Strategies.
Yep.
I saw did allude to the advice piece. And that, I guess, goes to your point about the sole purpose test, that there are limits on fund members' resources as a whole being used to provide advice and bringing in what's happening right now on the quality advice review and the future of super fund advice. Have you got a view on what you think might be happening or like?
Well, I think it's hard to know, I guess, politically, because obviously the quality of advice review was commissioned by a former government and hasn't released its final paper, but the interim paper was very, very interesting. And a key theme of that paper is an expectation that super funds have historically kind of, I guess, stood back and said, we'll manage the money and we'll, look after you and trust us. But they've typically not been coming forward in terms of wanting to get into the advice field, certainly not personal advice, although many of them have a relationship with an advisor. But the thrust of the proposals to date are very much that the super funds are very well placed to give advice because they do hold a lot of data about the member, and that there's an expectation in a sense that they will be more proactive in potentially approaching members and potentially offering guidance. I think it's I guess the way I look at it is historically, more or less, super funds have offered one retirement income product. So, I mean, there hasn't been advice required about which type of pension should I get, because there's only been one pension type, and typically the investment options are the same as the ones on the way through. So, in a sense, that you could say that the advice need hasn't been forefront of the trustees' minds, because I guess their interest is in the person simply seeing this as a continuation. It's all the same as when I was in accumulation. Right now I'm in pension phase. Yippee, I get a tax exemption. Isn't that great? And the government tells me how much to take because the government prescribes the minimum. But when you think about that, that's quite an unsophisticated position to be in, because the members are left, unless they do have an advisor, potentially in a default that may not be the best outcome for them, or may result in them living very frugally because they're taking a minimum income when they could actually well afford to take a bit more.
I mean, those minimum drawdowns are obviously designed to get you, if you last long enough, for it to disappear.
Correct.
But obviously the number of people who get to the big drawdown levels is relatively small.
Yes.
We're talking about life expectancy of 88. I think you get into the 90s before you have to start drawing down very substantial amounts. That it does leave retirees generally with significant balances at death, and a super fund that has no incentive to encourage you to spend more.
That's right.
Which I think is a big challenge, that potentially that's an opportunity for advisors to help their retiree clients enjoy the fruits of their labour. Certainly we see retirees dying with often as big a balance as they started with, sometimes more, and not having enjoyed it whilst it was there. And on the other extreme, we see late 50s people endangering their own retirement by buying homes for their kids or putting their kids through university. So, I mean, that is a challenge that requires significant amounts of advice. And you would question whether the super fund is the right place to get that. And clearly most of the audience of this podcast...
Well, I question whether the super funds will have the appetite for that, because when you think about it, they're already quite a broad church in offering a range of investment options and potentially a range of products. They're there to suit the needs of a large cohort of members, not to get into the tailoring side of things. So it's a nice idea perhaps that they will suddenly leap into giving advice, but I'm not entirely sure that will actually be how it plays out. But just something you said made me think of a point we were discussing before, which is when you think of just even the basic concept of income, up until retirement, people will think of income being simply the investment earnings. And it's a huge mind shift to think, well, now I'm in retirement. I think a lot of people just think retirement income, well, that's the income on my capital. So the reluctance to actually convert the capital into a cash flow. I mean, I sometimes wonder if we need a different terminology, because income just has this kind of very deeply held concept that it's the fruit of the tree and it's not the tree itself. And so that's a huge change in thought pattern and thought processes.
I mean, it is a really difficult transition for the human brain to deal with, that we go through 40 years of spending bad, saving good, and now we have to say to consumers, actually, spending good, just not too much.
Yes. Saving,
maybe it's time you stop thinking about that.
Yes.
And but we still need to be able to give them comfort that the undertakers, that you'll actually be able to cash the undertaker's check when you actually get there. And, what markets will do, what taxes will happen in the future, how long I'm going to live, is my spouse going to live longer than I am? How do I deal with all these uncertainties and spend with comfort? So the advisor sort of becomes as much a therapist and psychologist as they do a financial advisor.
Absolutely, and it's so important to treat the whole...
Yeah. Now, one point you raised about the sole purpose test and how that flows into who pays for this advice. Clearly, we know from practice that retirees are the people who are most willing to pay for advice, that 2/3 of all financial planning clients are over 55. And that shouldn't be surprising because, A, they've got lots more money and it's becoming an immediate problem that I've got to deal with this right now. And super funds have been limited in their ability to use members' money to subsidise or pay for those services. Would the same thing apply to the super fund investing in digital tools to deliver that advice, effectively enhancing their website?
It oughtn't to. I mean, the overriding thing is the digital tools need to be focused on the super fund. So if the tools are around, what will my balance be at this age, and playing around with different returns and the like. I think, if you had a specific tool that said, should I have a fixed or variable mortgage, then that probably is outside. So long as it's in the general territory of retirement savings and the super fund, where it fits into the retirement savings picture, that should be fine. And I think that is the area that is more likely to interest the super funds. The idea of kind of guidance or putting out cameos, or what you might call sort of investor literacy and try to improve standards of literacy and education. So I think super funds would be well placed to provide that kind of guidance. And, I think that, I suppose just on the quality of advice review, if we can divert from that for a moment, we've just made a submission on that. And one of the things we think is, to me, I'm not an advisor, so I don't know how this works, but to me it feels very artificial for the advisor to go in and say, well, it costs X amount of money to advise, on your super fund, and then we'll charge this other little bit about what's going on outside super. But disappointingly, the review, I guess, proposed that distinction be maintained, that it's only the part that relates to the super fund that should be able to be paid for out of the account. We've put forward a different idea, which is that really there should be some kind of modest release amount that is, I'm not going to say what amount it is, someone can figure that out, but that should be just released for advice.
That's like a condition of release, as well as being for a hardship, could be to pay for
financial advice, because that, then the advice can be, can look at the whole picture and can look at the spouse, for example, rather than this sort of constraint that for it to come out of the fund, it must be limited to that member because it's coming out of that member's account. And secondly, that it can only be limited to advice in relation to the super. I just think it's creating a ridiculous cost for someone to have to define that boundary and then for the trustee to supervise it. So, yeah, that's
an interesting point. I'm not sure I've given that too much thought, but certainly, we do a lot of work around budgeting and debt elimination, all of which can't be paid for from super.
Yeah.
And then the bits around retirement savings and potentially stuff around using a first-time super saver scheme.
Yes.
So you end up with this quite artificial split, which I guess we've just got so used to dealing with and haven't actually given it that level of thought. But that is actually quite an interesting idea.
Well, again, you get into this question, some people will say, but it's eroding savings, etc. But I think if you cap the amount and, made it, something that over time, you could have certain opportunities to do that. It just seems, I'm all for trying to make things simpler.
Yeah. And I guess these issues all arise when, as a society, we mandate that a 20-year-old, you're not allowed to spend, you can only spend 91% or 89% of your income now. You have to set aside 10.5 for retirement. That every time we start interfering in people's spending habits, we need to be very careful about the consequences, intended or otherwise, that arise from that.
Absolutely.
And so
we saw that with the COVID releases,
that the first-time super saver is a potentially overcomplicated way of addressing some of those issues for younger members, and the COVID releases were helpful. And maybe we just need to think about it over the longer term. Well, if you're forcing people to set aside a portion of their income, we have a duty to make sure that they are actually better off both now and in retirement.
Well, I do think that I probably, I guess when you look at it internationally, we could have a system where we said, well, instead of the tax concessions on super, we'll increase the social security. But because we're forcing people to save privately, not everyone's going to have the skills and the tools to be able to manage that. So I think it doesn't seem to be a big leap in my mind to accept that people will need assistance to navigate, what is a system which has a lot of choice and can, gives the individual a lot of freedom. But they need help to navigate it all.
Yeah. So is there anything else you'd like to add to the retirement income that we haven't covered off?
Well, I think, I think personally, having been involved in, what's been a bit of a very long project to really shine a light on retirement incomes, I feel very pleased that we do have the covenant. I think it's a really great first start, and I think it'll be very, very interesting to see the strategies. Particularly, I think the day one strategies are all kind of, it's like a race. They've all kind of got off the blocks. But as they mature and as they gather their data and do make their inquiries, I do think they will mature and it'll be very interesting. So I do feel like it's quite a tipping point, and I think I'm hopeful it will lead to new products that will really assist members to get the most out of retirement.
Well, certainly the ones that I saw in my brief review before setting out on this exercise did seem to sort of fairly slavishly copy the words of the covenant, and most looked like work in progress to me.
Absolutely, and I think that's why really, A, it's a start, and B, I guess it's probably a reflection, the fact that a lot of them are quite basic, to my mind, is actually proof of concept. It's why we need it, because it shows, in my mind, again, that without the covenant, there probably is not the focus on this part of the problem, if you like, that there ought to have been.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts on that with us, Ruth.
Thank you, Vince.
It's been great having you.
Thank you very much.
That was Ruth Stringer, superannuation partner at MinterEllison. As she said, the retirement income covenant on its own won't necessarily lead to greater innovation in the available retirement income products, but it will help focus the minds of the bigger super funds on the retirement income phase and away from the accumulation phase as their membership ages. The account-based pension will over time cease to be the dominant vehicle for spending superannuation savings and will be supplemented by innovative lifetime income streams. This will create a huge opportunity for advisors as a wave of super fund members reach retirement over the next decade with larger balances than previous generations. They also have higher expectations for what retirement means, and of course will live longer than their older equivalents. All of this is great news for advisors. Over the next 4 episodes, we'll delve into these opportunities and the related challenges for advisors. We'll chat to authors who have written extensively on the new retirement paradigm. A spoiler alert, this is as much about psychology as it is about the technicalities of products, regulations, tax and social security. We'll also talk to practicing advisors to learn what they're doing, and of course we'll chat to our sponsor GenLife about the innovative things they're doing in the income space with investment bonds and market-linked annuities. I've greatly enjoyed putting this series together, and I hope you'll enjoy listening just as much. So till next time, bye for now.